Well, good afternoon. Yeah, I was trying to think of a good joke to go to with a nerdy words sermon, and this other one came to mind. So a Catholic priest passed away, found himself at the gates of hell. He said, "Hey, what am I doing here? I thought I was supposed to be in heaven." They said, "Yeah, but look at this. Look at this contract that you signed when you finished seminary school." And he looked at it. He said, "Yeah, that's exactly the life I live." And the demon said, "Yeah, but look at this. Look at this little word right here." And he looked at it. He said, "Oh, celibate. I thought the thing said celebrate." So today we're talking about fairies, about English fairy lore. It's a really fascinating topic. Last time we were talking about how the word fairy originates with, it comes from the word fair, meaning little fair-skinned, fair-haired people, probably the indigenous people of England who were there before the Celts invaded and before the Romans invaded, little people who were known to hide in the forests and sometimes to paint themselves blue. And so the Roman invaders of Britain would have these occasional sightings of these little blue painted people scurrying around in the forests. And of course, one of the ways they dealt with this was by just cutting down the English forests. But this memory remained, and it's probably how we get our legends of fairies and elves and leprechauns, all of these interesting little stories of little forest people. And the fairy, interestingly enough, seldom appears in what is called the fairy tale. What we think of as the fairy tale, a story with some magic in it, was earlier known just as the old wives' tale. And this is not wife meaning a married person, but this is wife was an old English word for an adult, a mature woman, regardless of her marital status. That is why in a wedding, people are pronounced man and wife. It just means man and woman. So the old wives' tales, these were stories that were known to be told by nannies, housekeepers, babysitters, grandmothers, people who would watch the children and would tell them these bedtime stories. And not generally, for centuries. This was an oral tradition. This was a folktale tradition in which any particular housekeeper or any particular grandmother had a stash of these stories that the children would want to hear again and again. The story, they knew where the story was going, but it was not written down. It was adaptable. It was something that, where the story could mature along with the child. So you could tell the little kid's version of it. You could put the individual child that you were telling the story to. You could kind of, shape the main character of the story to be more like one particular person. And the story could grow with that person as they got older. Details could be added or subtracted from the story. When we think of like the old fairy tales that were collected, for example, by the Brothers Grimm, they were people who toured around Europe And they went around and they did not invent stories. They interviewed the old grandmothers and they asked them to tell the stories. And then they wrote them down the way that they heard them. Yeah, I think, as I recall, the Brothers Grimm were going around in the 1700s. Now, it can be surprising for us. Sometimes we will encounter one of these fairy tales, one of these old wives' tales in its kind of its pre-Disney incarnation. How are these stories different when we encounter the old European version? They can be shocking because they're brutal, they are bloody, they often involve dismemberment, disfigurement. Stories, for example, in early versions of the Cinderella story. Yes, that's right. That's right. You could say these stories were pretty grim. Boy, now I gotta wonder if maybe that word comes into our vocabulary from the Brothers Grimm, because yes, they were collectors of stories that we would find shocking, stories that we probably wouldn't even share with children. Certainly when Disney made their Cinderella movie, they decided not to use the part where the wicked stepmother, chops off her daughter's like heels and toes to try to get their feet into this little glass slipper. Or they did not use the section about how then at the wedding, Cinderella's friends, the birds, came down and pecked out her sister's eyes and blinded them. So these stories, they tended to have kind of very, very painful endings for their antagonist characters. I think in Disney, the worst thing they can do to somebody is have them fall off a cliff into kind of some hazy darkness. But these stories, in a way, they combine what we might think of as the fairy tale and also the horror story, the cautionary tale, the ghost story. The stories they were meant to be both inspirational and also kind of menacing, kind of frightening. They carried this connotation that, for children, if you are good, unseen forces, you could say kind of magical powers, will assist you. If you are bad, unseen forces, magical powers will hurt you. There's another, I think, really interesting subcurrent to this, which is when we think about these fairy tales as morality stories, alongside the biblical stories, the stories that children were hearing from the Bible, stories that children were hearing in church. And in the Bible, if you are good, good deeds will be rewarded, bad deeds will be punished by a very kind of paternal, watching deity. Whereas in the old wives' tales, in the fairy tales, good deeds, bad deeds, they tend to be rewarded and punished by natural forces and by maternal forces. So these two kinds of stories, they were both there to tell children to be good, to be honest, to be virtuous, to kind of, live those values. But they came at it from slightly different angles. Yes.
I was just wondering how much the change in the way she viewed. Many years ago, children were not viewed the same way you view them now. They were your insurance for your old age.
Yes.
I see parents stories that they tell me about how they were raised and what they did is involved.
Yes, yes. Well, part of it definitely is a change in what it means to be a child and what is considered appropriate for children. In the modern world, really in the industrial and post-industrial world, we are very much divided kind of by age lines. We've got this, school. It's like a factory, but it's a place for the safety of children so that adults can do their work. And then we have facilities for people of advanced age and disability. Whereas in these earlier times, people were not divided this way by age group, by what part of life you were in. So in Shakespeare's time, for example, your children were around the house. I mean, within the family household, it would go all the way from the children to the elderly. Children they would witness things like death. I mean, they would, there weren't really hospitals. Children knew what blood was. They knew what farming injuries looked like. Children were, and they had to be very resilient because they were going to grow up in a world in which life was precarious, in which people often got hurt or even died kind of within sight of the children. So we could certainly say in centuries past, children had a much higher shock tolerance because they weren't sheltered in this same way. And I mean, what will become of us who really shelter our children and say, like, childhood must be a time of innocence and it must be a time of being sheltered and nurtured. I don't know. What I do know is that what has kept the human race alive this long is children who are resilient and who know how to cope with very frightening things in life. Another function of the fairy tale was to help children, and particularly when we think about fairy tales, they often do have a focus on women's issues. They have a focus on girls becoming women, children becoming adults. They tend to culminate in people getting married, and also encouraging women to think about questions like, what will you do when you are in a position of authority, when you become the authority figure? As a girl approaches the possibility of womanhood and motherhood, is she going to grow up to be the good mother from the story? Is she going to grow up to be kind of the wicked stepmother who, has a certain power, a certain authority, and abuses that authority? So a closer look at our fairy tales, when we think about, Disney and the fairy tale industry, it tends to be, a lot of it centers on princesses, to the point where it's like a cliche, all of these Disney princesses. But that still connects back to this question of, if you suddenly found yourself with power, if you found yourself with authority, would you be corrupted by it? Every Disney princess story deals with that in some way, that question of, what are you going to be like when you actually get power? As I'm sure we all know, it's one thing to say, like, we're all equal when you've got nothing. But then often in history, that same person, once they get into the position of power, will suddenly become a proponent of hierarchy. Some fairy tales look at, life transitions. For example, the story of Little Red Riding Hood. This is, a story of a little girl who is, given the freedom to go off by herself into the woods. In the story, she is being stalked by this predator. Now, it's a children's story, so the predator is a wolf, but it's also a story about how as girls approach womanhood, as they go out into the world, they will meet people who will try to, kind of steer them down different paths. The story of Little Riding Hood, among other things, addresses the question of who can you trust and how do you know if you can trust them? Stories like Cinderella, when we think about the Cinderella story, it's a story about somebody who follows directions. They always do the nice thing, even though people are abusive. And then in the end, through magic, they get this elevation. But the Cinderella story, it contains a certain subversive element. We need to remember that this is a story that was told within monarchic societies that were ruled by people who generally grew up and lived kind of in isolation from the problems of commoners. So when we look at a fairy tale and it's got this, what we might think of as a kind of a worn out cliche, like a rags to riches story. It also contains this element of fantasy for people who lived, under the rule of kings and queens who were born in castles and spent their entire lives in isolation, surrounded only by the ruling classes. There is this fantasy. What would it be like if the next princess of, France or the next queen of England was somebody who had grown up in the countryside with the commoners, was somebody who, really knew about the struggles and the concerns of the common people, and the fantasy that somebody who was raised outside of the castle could kind of, govern the people more equitably. Shakespeare lived, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but Shakespeare lived actually during this major transition point in English Fairylore. This was the time when the King James Bible was being assembled. This was a time when the English language was poised to kind of overtake Latin and Greek as a major language of intellectual discourse and international discourse. This was a time when even people outside of England were starting to look at the English language. In terms of fairies, this was a time when fairy stories were starting to get written down. One big example at the time was a poet named Edmund Spenser, wrote a multi-volume work called The Fairy Queen, in which he, took English fairy lore, but he also reshaped it. He remolded it to make the central fairies in the story more like Queen Elizabeth and more like King Henry VIII. And so there was a change going on in which the way that people thought about fairies, the way that people wrote about fairies, was becoming mixed with the idea of the English monarchy, the kings and queens of England, having this magical power that comes from the land of England. This was also the time when other fairy stories were collected into a book that was very popular at the time called Robin Goodfellow, His Mad Pranks and Merry Jests, which would become the inspiration for the character of Puck in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. With this happening, the fairy tale, the old wives' tale, the fairy story, was changing in three significant ways. One thing was that it was changing from a women's improvisational storytelling to a kind of a men's printed, published kind of literature. So one thing that was happening was that people were starting to kind of systematize, codify this fairy lore, which up to that point had been just an impromptu, an improvisational storytelling thing. Another change was that it was getting mixed with the idea of the magic of royalty. In the old fairy stories, fairies did sometimes take an interest in social elevation, in elevating a, like a farm girl to the castle. But now the idea was that the fairies themselves had some kind of hierarchy, some kind of monarchy. And another change that was happening at the time was that the fairy stories were starting to be kind of cleaned up. Some of the more shocking elements, some of the more adult elements were being left out of the fairy stories as a way of getting them, kind of getting them past the censorship of an adult Christian audience. In 1689, an Englishman, John Aubrey, wrote about this change that he felt was going on. He wrote, "Before printing, old wives' tales were ingenious. And since printing came into fashion, till a little before the Civil Wars, the ordinary sort of people were not taught to read." He says, "Nowadays, books are common, and most of the poor people understand letters. And the many good books and variety of turns of affairs have put all the old fables out of doors, and the divine art of printing and gunpowder have frightened away Robin Goodfellow and the fairies." Even in 1689, there was this concern that the transition from a free-form oral tradition to a printed literature was going to somehow take the magic out of English fairy lore. We can see some elements of this transition in Shakespeare's writing. Shakespeare has become for us a major source of information about fairies, although Shakespeare, as we'll see, he kind of combined different pieces. In the Midsummer Night's Dream and in The Tempest, Shakespeare's fairies are full human size. Otherwise, you couldn't put them on stage. Then when Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, he senses this transition to the idea that fairies must be very, very small. And one of the central speeches in Romeo and Juliet is about this fairy called Queen Mab, who can ride around in a nutshell, in a chariot that's drawn by insects. So in his time, they're developing this idea that if fairies exist, they must be able to hide because they're very, very tiny. Shakespeare's fairies, interestingly enough, don't seem to be able to fly. In Midsummer Night's Dream and in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's fairies can only fly if they ride on the back of some flying creature or if they have some kind of chariot. In The Tempest, the fairy Ariel flies on the back of a bat. So even the idea of fairies having wings seems to have been a later development. In creating his distinctive fairies, Shakespeare got to kind of cherry pick from numerous sources. There were stories and superstitions that he knew from growing up in England. He seems to have been immersed in this oral tradition from his mother, his grandmother, his babysitter. But he was also reading the fairy books that were coming out in his lifetime, books like The Fairy Queen and The Mad Pranks of Robin Goodfellow. So when, in each of Shakespeare's plays that feature fairies, he has slightly different fairies with different rules, different abilities, different functions. But each one of these seems to be just from him saying, well, for this particular story, I'm going to need this particular kind of fairy. When I started studying Shakespeare's fairy writing, I expected to find that he, as a writer, would have established, like, these are the rules of what fairies can do. And then I was very surprised to find that with his fairies, as with his ghosts and witches, there are different rules according to which story. Shakespeare's fairies, like the ones in the fairy tales, they take an interest in the transitions of human life. Shakespeare's fairies are particularly interested in matchmaking and marriage and safe childbirth. And they also play a significant role in steadying the cycles of nature so that there can be plants, so that there can be animals and people. One example is Titania, the fairy queen from A Midsummer Night's Dream. When Shakespeare writes about, now this is a play where there is a fairy king, there is a fairy queen. They've got some kind of relationship. They're not necessarily married to each other, or if they are married to each other, it seems to be some kind of open marriage. One of the most fascinating things about the relationship of Oberon and Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream is that Shakespeare gives them equal power. As we'll see, one of the themes of the play is that Oberon keeps on telling Titania what to do. She keeps defying him. So unlike the, kind of very stratified gender roles of Shakespeare's time, in which husbands had a great deal of authority over their wives, Oberon does not have this kind of authority. He doesn't have this kind of control over Titania. He can threaten her, she can threaten him, and it was, as we'll see, the only way that he can ultimately get her to his side of the argument is going to be by drugging her. I've got a cough drop. Do you need one? Okay. Yes. Another interesting thing about the fairy king and the fairy queen in A Midsummer Night's Dream is that if we look closely, they both have their kind of specific roles, their specific powers and jobs to do. The fairy queen, Titania, she reigns over butterflies and bees, fireflies, medicinal herbs, and flowers. So she's kind of in this couple, she is the gardener and the botanist. She has a special knowledge of plants and medicinal plants. Whereas Oberon, when he talks about the forces of nature, he talks about bears and leopards and wild boars. He has this greater interest in larger animals, predatory animals. His first idea when he decides to kind of drug his wife and make her fall in love with something, his first idea is that she should fall in love with some kind of wild predator. Fortunately for the story, Oberon's assistant is this kind of playful trickster who plays a practical joke and turns somebody into a donkey instead. The two of them are having this argument. We find that the two of them have a balance of power. They have different and complementary sets of abilities. And that the two of them are supposed to combine their powers to do this circular fairy dance I put this picture on the screen last month. They are going to refer to this in the play. What we're seeing here, this moon-like circle in the grass. We know scientifically that comes from a certain kind of fungus that grows in the dirt and that can kill, these kind of rings of grass. The belief in ancient England was that these circles were made by the friction of fairy dancing, and that fairies holding hands and dancing in circles in the moonlight would steady the cycles of the moon, and that then the cycles of the moon would steady the seasons, the weather, the atmosphere, the environment, so that plants could grow in their own seasons. So in the play, Oberon runs into Titania. These two they've been apart. They haven't seen each other maybe in a year. They're angry with each other. And she expresses this concern to him. She says, "No night is now with him or Carol blessed. Therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger, washes all the air that rheumatic diseases do abound. And thorough this distemperature we see, the seasons alter. Hoary-headed frosts fall in the fresh lap of crimson rose, and on old winter's chin an icy crown, an odorous chaplet of sweet summer buds, as in mockery set, the spring, the summer, the childing autumn, angry winter change their wonted liveries." She's saying that the seasons are exchanging their usual costumes. They're changing their clothing. "And the mazed world by their increase now knows not which is which." Titania is, when she sees Oberon, her first concern is that he is refusing to join in the fairies' circle dance. And because they're not doing the dance correctly, the phases of the moon are all out of cycle. They're all out of time. And that the seasons of the earth are confused, that the seasons are wearing each other's clothes. And this is going to kill all of the crops. It's going to drown the wheat fields, and that then everything is going to die. So this is a good example of one of those places where it kind of looks like a bunch of very, kind of charming Shakespearean nature poetry. It is, but it is also this apocalyptic struggle. It is a struggle in which the fairy king and queen are in this argument, and their argument is going to bring about the end of the world. In Shakespeare's time, the end of the world looked like this. This is the time that Shakespeare lived. Shakespeare lived in a time of climate crisis in the late medieval and Renaissance period, unusually low temperatures and high rainfalls causing crop loss, with resultant loss of livestock and surges of plague. Some climatologists call this the Little Ice Age. And it was particularly bad in the years that Shakespeare was writing A Midsummer Night's Dream. So when the play was first staged and Titania came out on stage and gave this monologue about how the seasons are confused and the summers are too wet and the crops are drowning, for people in Shakespeare's audience, they were listening and they were saying, yes, this is what's happening. This is something that they had witnessed with their own eyes. And some people, King James, for example, some people were saying that the bad weather was the result of witchcraft and witches and curses. And unfortunately, Shakespeare lived in a time in which a time when people were engaging in witch hunting as a way of either dealing with or kind of avoiding the topic of climate change. Shakespeare proposes this other thing. He works this current event, this news story, into his play. Shakespeare also lived in a time when the rise of Puritans was leading to a decline in the old indigenous pagan rituals. So when people went to see Midsummer Night's Dream, another kind of running theme of it was that not only the fairies, but also the people have stopped doing their moonlight dances. The people have stopped doing their pagan rituals to steady the seasons. And that this also might be a contributing factor to the seasons kind of running out of joint. Now, Oberon refuses to join in this circle dance because Titania has adopted this baby, this changeling child. And Oberon kind of wants this boy from India, whom his wife has adopted. Oberon wants this boy to maybe to be his new sidekick, or he wants him as a kind of conversation piece. So Oberon keeps refusing. She keeps trying to get him to join the dance. He keeps saying, first, you need to give me this thing that I want, and then I'll join in the dance. Titania cares more about the well-being of nature, about the forest and farmland. In Midsummer Night's Dream, Oberon then gets distracted by this other thing. He sees this girl following this guy around in the forest, and this girl really likes him, really wants to marry him. She keeps saying that she, will whatever, unconditionally surrender to this guy. In Midsummer Night's Dream, Oberon he takes a real interest in the story of this girl. He really wants this couple to get together. One possibility is that Oberon is having trouble in his own relationship. He's finding it impossible to kind of to influence or control the woman in his life. And so then he sees this teenage girl following this guy around. He seems to get it into his head like, yes, that's what I want to see. So he gets sidetracked trying to bring this couple together. Oberon will ultimately, in the story, he'll ultimately get the changeling child. Or it could come around to some resolution in which they'll each have this child for part of the year. But somehow they achieve balance because Oberon plays this prank on the fairy queen. He drugs her, and his sidekick fools her into falling in love with this kind of ridiculous actor who temporarily has the head of a donkey. Interestingly enough, Oberon wins what he wants, but he's unable to feel good about it. Even when his sidekick says, hey, you won, she gave you what she wanted. Don't you feel good about it? Oberon has kind of an empty feeling. It seems that he has found that he is unable to control Titania without resorting to this kind of underhanded trickery. So at the end of the story, he has not gained a superiority over her. He has kind of lost this dispute by having to resort to underhanded methods. But at the play's end, the dispute is finally settled. Oberon joins in the dance to steady the rhythms of nature. And the play ends with the fairies dancing in their circle, and even coming from the forest to enter into this house in order to study not only the cycles, the lunar cycles and natural cycles, but also to bless these couples to produce healthy offspring. They sing now until the break of day. Through this house each fairy stray, to the best bride bed will be, which by us shall blessed be. And the issue there create ever shall be fortunate. So here again, in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, he combines these elements of English fairy lore. On the one hand, the element of studying the cycles of nature, the element of studying the cycles of the moon so that plants can grow. But he also combines it with this other thing, the transition from maidenhood to adulthood, the transition in which the teenagers get paired off with each other, and that they are going to now make this transition into parenthood. Fairies, close out with this. Fairies are still a major industry. We still have fairy tales and, fairy toys, fairy stuff, fairy books. Fairies are doing all right. Who can think of the ways in which children still, what fairies do children still believe in modern times? The Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. What? Oh yeah. Wow. Well, that's really cool. Yeah. It's still a survival of the tradition of fairies as little nighttime helpers. Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. So, when we think about these two, Santa Claus has been kind of half admitted into Christianity, or you could kind of say that allowing Santa Claus into Christianity is a little bit like putting him in witness protection, in that he's not the hunted fugitive anymore. But yeah, these are a good example of the resilience, the survival of the fairy in children's belief, even within our puritanical Christian world. So, do we have any questions about this lesson? Well, good. Well, I really appreciate it. And this no, that's not it. This is it. Oh, okay. And if anyone is interested, I did bring some more copies of Supernatural Shakespeare, Myth and Ritual in Merry Old England, an exploration of fairies, as well as witches, ghosts, royalty, enchanted forests, and indigenous English festivals. So thank you very much. Good, and I will see you next time.